but I'm bad at small talk. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll just start. I'll be going for about 3 hours. No. Then, okay. On seeing photographs of the Bergen-Belsen and Dachau concentration camps, Susan Sontag remarked that nothing she'd seen in photographs or in real life ever cut her sharply, deeply, instantaneously. Indeed, it was realistic for her to divide her life in two. That life before, as it was before she saw them, aged 12, and after, though it was several years, she says, before she better understood what they were about. But it would be unrealistic to say, knowing her work as a whole, that Sontag was blind to the danger of images and their vexed relationship to human suffering. Such concerns, in fact, consume much of her attention in her famous work on photography. And yet, despite these dangers, I want to try to make sense of Sontag's shock and the claim with which that experience was tied. Part of the risk attendant upon doing so will, I hope, be minimised by my shifting emphasis from a discussion of the image to images, to begin with specific cases and see what they might help elucidate. I do this not only because overly general accounts of the image, I think, tend towards a kind of vacuity, but that a focus on the concrete and even the personal is central to my concerns. In 1990, in Australia, a private members' bill was proposed which would reduce the minimum date of termination of pregnancy from 24 to 21 weeks. Soon after it was announced that the legislation would be voted upon, politicians began to receive from an anonymous source an image of a fetus at 21 weeks, pictured sucking its thumb, something like this. It was later revealed that the image was not of a live fetus at all, but from a medical lab and sent in as a joke by some student wag with a dreadful sense of humour. By then, however, the reaction against the photo had set in. Critics called the uses of such images upsetting, manipulative, bullying, hectoring, and of course, emotive. Such reactions are common. In her essay, The Emotional Imperative of the Visual, Kirsty McLaren makes a parallel point. Images of the fetus try to evoke emotion and cast that emotion as evidence of the significance of the fetus. The viewer's presumed reaction to seeing the fetus establishes the fetus as a subject. The reaction is construed by pro-life campaigners as a natural and irrefutable indicator of the moral connection between our society and the fetus. The philosophical conceptualization of personhood, in which capacity and autonomy are usually necessary, is not relevant in this moral landscape. The fetus places a moral duty on pro-life activists because of its incapacity. In Fetal Rights, and another essay, S.C. Cornell puts the matter this way: the strongest argument against abortion is not an argument at all. It's the image of the fetus. Tiny feet, perky nose, pre-melanin skin, and of its often grisly death. The persuasive potential has been clear for over a century. Cornell is saying, in other words, that although such images may have impact, they are properly outside the realm of reason. The opposition that McLaren works from here is a standard one: emotional response versus reasonable discussion. I don't think, however, that such an opposition is coherent, and it may also be beside the point. For one thing, it would be unusual to suggest that those who favour using such images do so because they are emotional, as if this were a good in itself. And even if some do say this, surely a better reason exists for those who support their use, that the distribution of such images to politicians may force them to confront the fact that if killing something like what is pictured is what they were killing, then they may not be able to support such a bill, or at least not support it for the reasons the law sanctions. I want to be clear here, I am not stating a position on abortion in this talk, and nor am I suggesting that anyone who sees such an image will be pro-life, which is clearly absurd. rather than trying to assess the role of such images in the discourse by which they are surrounded and the philosophical significance of such talk. The first point to be made is that opposition to their use is not to be found on the sorts of oppositions McLaren and Cornell, conceptual oppositions, that McLaren and Cornell predicate their claims. To begin to see this, I want you to imagine a scenario in which a certain kind of mimetic operation causes a change in someone. I want to then ask what that change would amount to and how the person so changed and we might want to speak of it. And I say mimetic operation because I also want to put in parentheses for a moment even ideas of desire. Imagine two close friends, Rosa and Lena. Rosa falls pregnant and Lena is moved by her friend's love for her unborn child, by what love might mean in such a case. 1 year later, Lena falls pregnant. But far from being excited, she resents the pregnancy, regrets it, its inconvenience, the lack of planning, the seeming unsuitability of the father, the bad timing, and so on. She thinks of getting an abortion, but demurs, recalling her friend Rosa's love, coming to the realisation, and a painful one at that, of her already having been changed by that love. Lena arrives or finds herself in the position where she thinks it impossible for herself, personally, to get a termination. If asked about this, she might say she couldn't do it, quote, because I've come to see what I'd be doing were I to have an abortion, or because I've come to feel differently about my having an abortion. A certain kind of philosopher, perhaps Cornell or McLaren, may assess these statements and say that the second one is the correct one. Because the second is clearer about the fact they would say that this change is an emotional one. But this would mistake the matter. For a start, regarding emotions, we may ask, which emotion? As I said, Lena finds it unpleasant to be pregnant, inconvenient, and she resents it. But she also wishes she were not resentful, because she takes a view of her resentment as if that resentment were attitude towards her child, as though that child were born. And this view has been elicited in her, we might say, intersubjectively, mimetically, by another, by the love she recalls seeing in her friend. There's an issue here about mimesis as a moral phenomenon, which I'll take up later. For now, it is enough to say that to find out what Lena thinks of this change, would need to see how she speaks of it. It's hard to see how she conceives of this moral impossibility and termination by any reference to a reticence about killing a fetus. Note the implausibility of the grammatical construction, my fetus, or even more implausibly about God's fetus. And this is why the shift should be characterised by the locution, I came to see what I'd be doing, rather than I came to take a different attitude to what I'd be doing. But importantly, this entails that it would also be wrong, as pro-life advocates often do, to put her shift in terms of a claim like, I came to realise what kind of thing I would be causing the death of. For that suggests a morally neutral redescription of the fetus independent of her relation to it. Like she would see things the same way were this fetus not in her belly, but being gestated, for instance, in a cabinet on some space station. To be clear, the perspective being defended here isn't that it makes no sense to say that moral conclusions follow from the facts. Rather, it's that the facts, as we take them to be, condition what our sense of what moral conclusions we may draw. To see this, I'll use another example. Let's say we witness a frail elderly man in distress being beaten up by 3 thugs, and so we run towards the scene. What were the facts here upon which we concluded to make an intervention? In the first instance, phenomenologically speaking, there doesn't seem to be anything like the appearance of facts about which we reached a conclusion. We simply ran. In any case, the facts here are inseparable from what one sees and describes of a frail man being beaten up by thugs. To choose to describe it otherwise, say a pathetic weakling figures the scene differently. Even an ostensibly clinical description, like a mature male human being physically assaulted by 3 young male humans, carries with it a certain sort of distance, which is itself morally conditioned, and in certain circumstances we would even see such a description as repugnant. That doesn't mean people might not describe the scene in that way, just that it makes no sense here to talk of empirical facts about which moral conclusions will be drawn. And we should also note the moral stridency present in those who are upset by the use of ultrasound images with which I began my talk, and that many of those who reacted so strongly against such images would, under different circumstances, have no hesitation in using images with those they thought of as only having the most abstract understanding of what it means to, say, drop bombs on civilians, of starvation, or of what dying of AIDS looks like. What would we make of the claim that these are emotional, or as some prefer, emotive, not abstract and universal, containing philosophical discussions or personhood? And what would we make of the idea that such images are therefore irrelevant to the task of ethics? And could the same be said of the following? This is one of the most famous images associated with the transatlantic slave trade, published in 1788. It aimed to show how tightly packed slaves were, in some cases with less than 3 feet of headroom. Or images, for instance, of Wilson Chin and Peter, differently named sometimes, both from 1863, circulated in the mid-19th century in Harper's Magazine and becoming central to the abolitionist cause. What would we make of someone who said of these photographs that they were emotive and that as an argument they are null and void? Or, to paraphrase S.C. Cornell, the strongest argument against slavery is not an argument at all. It's the image of the enslaved, beaten, scarred and branded. Here the words take on a new meaning for us and sound suspect. At the risk of labouring a disavowal, I am not saying that abortion is difficult to talk about, especially in American. I realise how heated it is. I'm using it as a visual example. I'm not saying one day that abortion will or should be seen in the same way, or that it should be. This isn't about moral equivalence, but about what we see fit as material for ethical reflection and the sorts of inconsistencies in our ideas of what is acceptable. But were someone to say this, that they are emotive, one response might begin with agreement. But then the question would be why they so move us. Why do these photographs still retain their force? And a possible answer to that may be that they allow us to have an imaginative and concrete understanding of slavery, where before one might have had an overly abstract notion of what was meant by the term. My father used to say that the fastest route to becoming a vegetarian would be to visit an abattoir. His point wasn't that suddenly emotion would suddenly here trump reason. There is no doubt emotion would be involved, but part of that is internal to a sense of a response to the prompt, you want to know where your burger comes from? In situations like this, an honorific like reason, especially when opposed to emotion, will mislead us. To use the example from literature, here is King Lear looking over his kingdom and realising he has neglected the poor. Poor actually doesn't do well reading Shakespeare with his gay accent. I need to be like Gilbert or something. There's poor naked wretches. Well, sir, you are, but by the perfume. No. This pitiless storm, how shall... That was quite Gilbert, actually, wasn't it? Anyway, I'll stop. How shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from such seasons as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take physical, meaning take your own medicine. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel. How are we to understand this? Was it Lear's emotions which modified his reason, or his reason which modified his emotion? Either option here misconceives what's going on. Here it would be better to perhaps abandon emotion versus reason and simply speak of thinking well or thinking poorly, of lucidity versus error. This is not to say that our feelings may not be gotten on the cheek, or that they're infallible windows through which the real can be seen. We might, for instance, be overcome by sentimentality or bathos. But here I want to say that it's not simply our feelings that have led our reason astray, but contrarily that sentimentality, for instance, isn't merely a way of throwing reason off, but one of the forms of falseness itself. It is surely not the philosopher's task to denounce things, such as, say, sadness, but to be able to discern cheap versus serious forms of them. Will Girardian anthropology help us get further here in a better, more complete sense of moral obligation? I think so, but only if it is understood in a particular way. In his article, Naturalising Ethics, Paul Dumichel, I was speaking to Paul last week and I sent him this morning, so I'm not talking about it. Paul Dumichel argues that Girard appears to suggest that what we call morality is in fact, in part, derived from distinctions which rest on more or less lucidly perceived differences between those actions that lead to sacrificial crises and those that either constitute obstacles to its reenactment or put an end to collective violence. Although Dumichel's paper is, by his own admission, exploratory, I don't think ethics can be naturalised, or certainly not in this way. If we read Nietzsche's famous passage in The World of Power about the decadence of the doctrine of the equality of all souls before God, of the human as only enduring through sacrifice, then what will strike us about Girard's reading of this text will be that Girard sees in Nietzsche an astonishing corroboration of his anthropology. Famously, that between Dionysus and Jesus, it is, quote, not a difference in regard to their martyrdom, it is a difference in the meaning of it. But what is the meaning of meaning here? At one level, we could say the difference is the revelatory meaning of Christian history. At another, we could frame this meaning as a moral meaning. That where Nietzsche proclaims to praise what he sees in the Dionysian, Girard glosses Nietzsche's view by saying, here I quote Girard, a culture has to pay a price in order to breed a class of iron man. It has to assume even the worst forms of violence. Girard is here saying, in effect, that where others sugarcoated the Dionysian, Nietzsche saw this violence and endorsed it. What could we call this but a moral depravity? And Girard obviously sees it as such. Then again, Girard's work is not supposed to be normative in any sense. He takes the path of the theorist who describes in scientific terms, anthropological terms, rational terms, the development of culture and religion. But I'd suggest there is no way around the moral when describing the anthropological, and not merely in a supplementary way. This is perhaps hidden because Girard is operating at the level of textual exegesis and anthropology, and after all, it would simply be grandiose for him to say, after all, and by the way, sacrificial killing of the sort Nietzsche wants, is like pretty evil. Any argument justifying that conclusion would be, to us, less obvious than the argument itself. In any case, the judgment is inseparable from the observation in Girard. In such context, it would be unnecessary for Girard to say, and just as a side note, we should exercise compassion for the victim. Because he relies on a sense of the human that is already ethically conditioned. After all, what else could the term victim mean? The question is whether Girard is revealing an anthropological point or an ethical one. Surely it is both. Or rather, this distinction no longer makes sense. To talk of a victim is simultaneously revelatory in the anthropological sense and inherently normative. Yet to think moral talk, as suggested by Michelle, can grow simply out of anthropological or sociological talk of taboos, interdictions, or even social contracts won't work. If you're tempted to think so, imagine someone, after having accidentally run someone over on a freeway, saying, "Oh my God, what have I done? I have broken the taboo against killing." Or, "Oh my God, what have I done? I have violated the interdiction on interest-specific homicide." What we mean by moral aren't applications of ideas like interdiction or taboo, but rather standing moral judgment of them. Girard's work itself does this, even if it never proclaims itself to be doing so. But in saying we're here talking of a moral attitude towards the person as victim, what room does mimetic theory even have for the person? We used in mimetic theory to speak of the interindividual relation, the idea that we are not individuals but interindividuals. And this way of putting matters well captures the fact that human beings are constituted first and foremost in their relations to others. But in our moral relations, the concrete individual is precisely what is at stake. The descriptive truth of intersubjectivity, the constitution of the human person through his or her shared life in language and in communities of practice, should not block from view the normative claim that our sense of others is ethically conditioned. The individual may not exist, but people still do. To see this, consider how remorse functions with us. Imagine tonight walking back to your hotel and being confronted by a beggar who is assertive, aggressive, and insistent. He demands money but will not move. You push him back and he stumbles and falls onto the road where he is hit by a passing car and killed. Many of you I don't know personally about your meta-ethical stances, yet here I feel I can read your minds. You'll likely be gripped by remorse, haunted by this event for a long time to come. There are 2 points to be made here. What I am calling remorse isn't a mere emotion, yet an emotional response is internal to the recognition of what one has done. Indeed, we might say in despair, "My God, what have I done? Mon Dieu, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait?" Again, by remorse, I'm not primarily describing an emotional reaction. It isn't the emotion here that provides remorse with its sense or legitimacy. Rather, I'm describing the meaning of what one has done. It makes no sense to speak of remorse without its emotional component. You can't really imagine someone going to deep remorse and yet feeling nothing. And just as a reaction will not import anthropological categories, nor will it draw its sense from the major traditions in normative ethics, virtue ethics, deontology, or utilitarianism. For those of you who thought I might be loyal to the mainstream in philosophical ethics, here at least I'm not. Again, try these options out. My God, what have I done? I've destroyed the life of a rational being with self-determination. Or, my God, what have I done? I've acted recklessly and violated the social contract. What have I done? I have undermined my chances for flourishing. What have I done? I have contradicted my own free chosen principles. And further to say we would be haunted by killing this person, it's necessary to point out that we will not be haunted by a principle. We will not be haunted by a duty. We will be haunted by a person, the person whose life we took. The person in their concrete reality confronts us. And of course, the concrete personal can be confronted. To see this, consider the creedal claim: he was crucified, died, and was buried. Now look at Hans hopping the youngest, the body of the dead Christ in the tomb. What the painting here pictures is not a Christ-type person, but a concrete being. Here Christ's death is rendered concrete in image in an incomparable way. And part of that is tied to the visibility of the victim, the realism, which Girard and Schwager and many others see as properties of biblical descriptions of violence. This is neither a depiction of a mythological figure, nor is it something that would provoke us to say in a Kantian idiom, "Here lies a sentient being." It is rather death of a person. It calls to us personally, as it famously did to Dostoevsky, whose wife was worried that he'd be fined. because he kept trying to get closer to it, who was obsessed with this painting. But shortly, I'll just go into the detail. But shortly, one objection to what I'm saying here is that it veers towards a kind of individualism and a subjectivism. To counter this, we need to be able to see the universality of the claim as to what we owe others, at the same time see the particularity of the victim, in light of which a moral response must be understood. An analogy might be used. Were one to grieve the death of a child, it is not merely a child has died, or even one of my children, let alone a rational being who is grieved, but that child who has died. Of course, the grief would be the same regardless of the child lost, but it is irreducibly focused on the child that has died. We love people, we feel remorse, and we grieve them in their particularity. Someone swept up in scapegoating, a person who later sees what they have done and feels remorse, is as it is because they have wronged a human being. But in order for the scapegoater to understand the moral gravity of what they have done, the victim must be present to them in their concrete individuality, because it is precisely in that form that makes sense of something like remorse. When one kills a human being, it is of course true that the victim might have been someone else, and yet the moral response would be the same. But again, in remorse, one is not haunted by every man. And claiming more than simply that in killing a human being, one is therefore haunted by a particular one. I am not describing a psychological particular tied to a general moral principle, for such would imply that such a haunting is extraneous to our moral response. That what is really at issue is the death of a representative of Homo sapiens. But individuality isn't reducible to individuating features. If we were to accidentally kill our own child instead of a stranger, there's a lot of killing going on in this paper, I realise that. Instead of a stranger, the nature of our remorse would be the same, even if the dimensions of the suffering were to differ. Part of the idea here is that for someone to be seen as a human being is to be seen as someone particular, as someone's child, as someone who can be broken by misfortune, as a possible recipient of someone's love. We see that the tramp we killed is someone's friend to the extent that it is intelligible that he rise to friendship's demands, even if he doesn't have any friends. This is part of our sense of someone being one of us, meaning sharing a common humanity. Our remorse is focused, concrete and particular because humans to us are this. Numbering our children or numbering our friends rather than naming them wouldn't be treating children or friends differently. It would give a completely different sense to the concept friend or child. Similarly, eating our pets, some philosophers might say, would be morally wrong. But it's probably more accurate to say that those who ate their pets wouldn't have pets in the same sense of the term, which we usually employ that term. Put in mimetic terms, it seems obvious that we can see the value of others. Our sense of their value can be sharpened when we see them in the light of another's love. Or that contrarily, prisoners can be made morally invisible to their guards when denied visits from loved ones. But even in the absence of such love, we may see people in the light of somebody's love, that they might be the object of somebody's love, even if that someone needs to be the same, a projection. And I want to say here that seeing this, what is revealed is not the love of another, but what that love discloses. Not the virtue of the saint, but what virtue reveals, the preciousness of each human being. Girardians have spent considerable time talking about positive mimesis, and it's understandable, but I think it can be misleading. In Aschenbeck-Klostitz, Girard says, up to a certain point, we might be in a state of positive undifferentiation, in other words, identified with others. This is Christian love and exists in our world. Differentiation is difficult to render in English, or it's too easy in some ways. In English, positive mimesis sounds a bit like Norman Vincent Peale or Dale Carnegie. As a Girardian, positive often means constructive, optimistic, helpful, good role models. But the French positive has a range of associations not present in English. among them real, concrete and undeniable. To draw out one possible sense that such a figuration might have, consider the following passage from A Common Humanity by the Australian philosopher Raymond Gaita. He is describing working in a mental health hospital as a student with a chronically, hopelessly mentally ill. Quote, one day, he's an atheist by the way, one day a nun came into the ward. In her middle years, only her vivacity made an impression on me until she talked to the patients. Then everything in her demeanour towards them, the way she spoke to them, the facial expressions, the inflections of her body, contrasted with and showed up the behaviour of a noble psychiatrist. She showed that they were, despite their best efforts, condescending, as I too had been. She thereby revealed that even such patients were, as a psychiatrist and I had sincerely and generously professed, the equals of those who wanted to help them. But she also revealed that in our hearts we did not believe this. A Girardian might say that seeing such a nun may prompt us to care in similar ways for the afflicted, and it may well do, or hope that it does. In this sense, use the example of positive mimesis, in that sense of functioning as some kind of non-rivalrous role model. But what it also points to here is the way that somebody's behaviour may be revelatory for us. Not just the person giving such care, but those cared for. Note that Gaita is not saying that were he or any of the doctors working at the hospital asked if they thought the patients were their equals, that they'd denied it. Indeed, they would have affirmed such an idea wholeheartedly or endorsed it conceptually. But Gaita says that what the nun's behaviour showed him first was that such patients really were his and the doctor's equals, and second, that he and the doctors didn't really believe that. But what Gaita is suggesting here is that nun's behaviour reveals something about the objects of this nun's love, the patients themselves. Her behaviour reveals to Gaita that such people were, in fact, our equals. Admittedly, the scene here does reveal something mysterious, and there are forms of thinking that allow conceptual room for mysteries of this sort, others which do not, and most which don't even perceive the need for doing so. But we are invited to entertain the idea that the contours of the nun's demeanour fitted the shape of the reality which it disclosed. Here we are not simply talking about, say, the virtue of love as an excellence, or the good that may have come from the nun's behaviour, or even, that she set a good example, for its capacity to make clear the sacredness, or in the terms of Wolfgang Pahlaver's reading of Simone Weil, the holiness, or as Gaita prefers, the full humanity of those afflicted who have been made invisible to others. In a biography of his father, Gaita described his growing up in central Victoria in the 1950s. Romulus Gaita, his father, had fled the former Yugoslavia with a German wife and arrived as refugees. His father had befriended a man named Vacek at an immigrant workers' camp. After the compulsory 2 years working, Vacek went mad and went to live 15 kilometres away from the Gaita's shadow. Visibly insane, Vacek talked to himself, did off-putting things like eating food with his own urine. After the autobiography came out, a journalist asked Gaita whether Vacek had seemed strange to him as a child. Gaita said no, but then wondered why. Quote, objectively, after all, he was very strange, and the answer came to me that was my father and Laura, as a friend of the family, behaved towards Vacek without condescension. And had they condescended to him, had it shown their tone, voice or demeanour, in their body language, as we often say, the cruel sensitivity that children often possess, would have made me conclude that Vacek was not entirely one of us. As it was, the contrary was true. Their treatment of Vacek enabled me to see him, his strange behaviour notwithstanding, as living yet just another form of human life. And that wasn't because I was particularly virtuous, it was simply because I saw him in the light of the behaviour towards him shown by my father and by his friend Laura. It is worth reflecting at what is at stake here and the kind of mimesis involved. It would be difficult to describe this as mimetic desire, even a desire for another's well-being, or a desire for the good, although it may intersect with those. It speaks of something more primary, a fundamental orientation to others as seen in the light of another's sight. And there's so many examples we give, very banal medical examples. It recalls to mind, although Gator doesn't mention this, the nun. Surely part of what is being talked about here is that the other is subject to a particularly revelatory form of attention, that which possibly reveals what it attends to. Last section. Simone Weil spoke often about attention and its importance to ethics. Iris Murdoch went so far as to say, for Weil, morality was a matter of attention, not will. And thus Weil's work should prompt us, she says, to develop a new vocabulary of attention. In other words, ethics at a deep level is inseparable from a kind of attention or witnessing. Correlatively, the Welsh philosopher Ira Collins says that a stance has to be taken, quote, unless it goes by default towards the difference between judgments which are of the highest significance for ethics and judgments that are not. In the former case, I'd say it's more a matter of registering an experience or marking an encounter than passing judgment, end quote. It may make philosophers uncomfortable to talk of ethics in terms of registering an experience or marking an encounter, as there's something irreducibly personal here. But Girard himself acknowledged something akin to this when he said that, quote, mimetic theory demands an existential understanding of what he grasped. But here more needs to be said about this personal response. Here I'm not talking about the personal assessment of some anthropological thesis, but the irreducibly personal element involved in moral response. The reason we don't see this or assume that when someone says something like this, we see the spectrum of subjectivism or relativism, is because we possess a distorted view of practical reason. The American philosopher Thomas Nagel, for instance, argues repeatedly against personal response. Quote, once we admit the existence of some other regarding reason, I shouldn't read the quote in a silly voice, because it makes it, but kind of, makes the evidence weak, doesn't it? Once we admit the existence of some form of other regarding reasons in general and application, we have to look for a way of specifying their content and principles of combination. That is not a first-person enterprise, end quote. To put this in context, Nagel saw himself as defending the kind of moral objectivism against its culture despisers, the relativists, Wittgensteinians, existentialists, and other miscellaneous continental deplorables, who would make morality some deeply personal thing. He contrasted his so-called rationalist account with what he called a subjectivist account, which he also called the merely personal account. In his many discussions of ethics, he sees this main challenge coming from the idea that there are no impersonal standards in ethics. There is much in Nagel's account that one could praise, but there is a baffling misunderstanding in his work about the nature of practical reason, especially of reason directed towards questions such as, what should I do? His attempts to distance all forms of practical reason from what is personal ends up producing a kind of distortion that produces absurdities. To see one of these contrasts two kinds of practical reason, both where one is trying to arrive at an answer free from psychological distortions, prejudice, and so on. Imagine that you have hired an accountant to come to an assessment of whether you should state your taxable income as $80,000 or $110,000. You could have done the tax yourself, given your familiarity with tax law and Excel, but have outsourced it to an accountant because you were busy. One form of practical reason. The accountant comes back and says, well, actually it's $230,000, although you couldn't get away with lying about it. But you were still busy. So you email a moral philosopher to solve the problem because you'll be skiing this weekend. You have a red card and won't have time for ethical reflection. You say to the philosopher, I need to decide whether it's okay to lie, and I need the answer by 8 a.m. Monday to submit by 9. Nagel falsely believes practical reason is indifferent to what practical ends are being entertained, as if the question of how best to resuscitate a person to save their life is of the same sort as whether you should bother to resuscitate them at all. Yet if true, why does it strike us as normal to outsource our bookkeeping, but completely insane, or either comic or sinister, to outsource our moral decision? And that is surely because the moral response, in a way different to other forms of practical reason in this restricted sense, is irreducibly personal. But in saying this, I don't want to be misunderstood. By personal, I'm not saying infallible, and I'm not imagining Descartes in his oven or a Husserlian reconstruction of the morality and tax evasion based on a transcendental reflection on the structures of the fiscal eye. Our views are informed, are always informed, enriched or degraded by our common life, by our literature, by poetry, our friends, by the forms of speech we engage in by reading Kant. Each of these is irreducible as it is essential. Although it may seem that Girard simply draws cognitive points from literature or religious texts, this cannot be the end of the story. Girard does not say that we can and must move beyond these texts and put them into scientific form. Even Girardians don't read the Bible to help them understand Girard. It's still the other way around. Against proponents of the Nouvelle Roman, Girard rightly saw that literature is connected to human life. The arts are the means by which we are taught things and not just merely happen to be how we are taught things. It would be strange to see a play about war and tell a friend about it, only for the friend to say, "Ah yes, that's true, I watched the news last night which confirms what you saw in the play." At their best, literature, painting, photography, and so on don't tell us things we could find out by other means. We react to these in various ways because of what is important to us and what we value and do, partly because they contribute to our sense of what matters most. And the arts are limited in ways we also need to countenance, that they won't reliably give us body counts or show numerical data which might fill in a complex picture. But they, like Denon's behaviour, have the potential to reveal what they attend to. But having trucked with images like reality itself is serious business, and realities located therein are easily mangled. To affirm, as some do, that we are all children of God is obviously an image, and by this I don't mean false. Yet that doesn't mean there aren't ways of distorting such statements. It would be inadvisable, for instance, to think we are children of God in the sense that we share 23 of our 46 chromosomes with Him. Rather, it is to inscribe God talk into the language of love. The truth of such talk can only be made sense of in such a language. If you're suspicious of my point here, you'll find it quickly confirmed that we try haphazardly to use synonyms for children, and by so doing produce bad poetry, bad philosophy, bad science, and bad theology all at once. We are the offspring of God. We are the juveniles of God. We are the minors of God. We are the ankle biters of God. We notice such offences against sense when a student unthinkingly uses a thesaurus to paraphrase something they don't understand, and we want to agree with the character in Tom Robbins' novel, Jitterbug Perfume, who shouts, "There are no such thing as synonyms." Of course there are, but synonyms have long blades, serrated edges, and small handles. Unless we see this, we may end up with a creed that begins, "We assert that there's one deity, the daddy invincible, manufacturer of utopia in the world." Sontag was right to see both the potential power of the image as well as its dangers. Images no doubt do present dangers to us, but we in turn are a danger to them. One way of taking the measure of the decline of culture and its moral imagination is by witnessing the impoverished images in which it trades, the unthinking ways in which its citizens talk, by what that culture thinks it important to sing about, what it paints and how it worships, about what it feels important to affirm or deny, and how it does so. Languages die either when people no longer speak them, or when they fail to speak to people. And we should think very seriously about this. For human beings live not only in nature, but in those symbolic worlds which, after having been made, show their gratitude by returning the favour and making us in their